Welcome back to This Explainer. If you've ever looked at global happiness indexes, you've probably noticed a pretty clear trend. It is almost always the freezing cold countries sitting right at the top. So why do nations like Denmark, Sweden, Norway, and Finland consistently dominate the top spots for life satisfaction? Today, we're going to dive deep into the data to solve this mystery. We'll unpack the structural, economic, and cultural realities that create these outcomes, and we'll contrast them with other major Western powers to really get a sense of what's going on.
Now, we've actually compared the East and West in a previous explainer, specifically looking at Japan versus the UK and USA. But this time, we're going to use the Marcinet's Health Capital Framework to compare Scandinavia with the UK and USA. This framework basically looks at how societal structures impact our well-being. By comparing these specific Western countries, we get to see how totally distinct approaches to the social contract directly affect population health, safety, and civic well-being. It is such a fascinating comparison because, think about it, all of these are advanced, high-income economies, yet they take wildly different paths to get there.
Okay, before we go any further, let's clear up a really common misconception right off the bat. Life satisfaction is a cognitive evaluation of your overall life. That's very different from daily happiness, which is all about immediate emotional joy. Honestly, if we just measure daily smiling and laughter, the globe looks much more uniform. Culturally expressive regions actually sometimes score higher there. But for deep cognitive satisfaction with how one's life is actually going, even on a gloomy, rainy Tuesday in November, Scandinavia is just in a league of its own. So when we talk about Scandinavia dominating these lists, we're specifically looking at evaluative well-being, metrics where people step back and rate their overall lives from 0 to 10.
To really peel back the layers of how these societies function, we're going to look at 5 distinct pillars today. 1. Wealth, taxes, and trade-offs. 2. Public safety and flexicurity. 3. Contrasting cultural well-being. 4. Healthcare and longevity. And 5. The structural trade-off.
All right, let's jump straight into section 1, wealth, taxes, and trade-offs.
We have to start by looking at the economic foundation, and there is a massive structural divergence here. Scandinavia collects up to 48% of its GDP in taxes. That means nearly half of everything produced goes back to the state, with countries like Denmark and Sweden on the higher end of that spectrum. Compare that to the US, which intentionally keeps taxes low to maximize disposable income, collecting roughly 25.6% of its GDP. The UK sits somewhere in the middle at around 33 to 35%. So while the US ranks incredibly high globally in nominal GDP per capita, we're talking around $85,000, that wealth is taxed much, much less by the state compared to its European peers.
And this isn't an accident. It represents a highly deliberate trade-off. The U.S. model relies heavily on private markets. That means individuals have to rely much more on personal wealth or employer-sponsored packages for their Social Security, healthcare, and parental leave. The Scandinavian model, on the flip side, utilizes broad-based, highly progressive taxation to essentially buy comprehensive cradle-to-grave universalism. They are paying for universal public services, robust paid parental leave, and heavy job retraining safety nets. The UK, meanwhile, funds its foundational national health service through general taxation, but has definitely suffered from structural underinvestment in recent years.
Moving right along to Section 2, Public Safety and Flexicurity. What's really interesting here is how economic structures directly spill over into physical safety. When we look at systemic violence, the intentional homicide rate tells a pretty stark story. The U.S. experiences a significantly higher rate of around 6.3 per 100,000 people. Compare that to the UK and Scandinavia, which maintain exceptionally low and stable rates, hovering just between 0.5 and 1.2. In fact, if you look at the Global Peace Index, nations like Iceland, Denmark, and Norway routinely rank in the top 15 globally, whereas the U.S. ranks much lower, which is largely driven by lethal violence and gun-related mortality.
But safety isn't just physical, right? It is also economic. When it comes to occupational safety, Scandinavia utilizes this fascinating model called flexicurity. Think of flexicurity as a safety net for the person, not the position. The labor market actually remains highly flexible, meaning companies can fire and hire easily to adapt to the economy. But the state provides heavy retraining and income security, so a laid-off worker doesn't suddenly face systemic poverty. Contrast this with the U.S. at-will employment model, where workers face high volatility with a pretty minimal statutory cushion, or the UK's moderate approach, which does have stricter redundancy rules in the US, but lacks that extensive state-backed retraining you see in Scandinavia.
Which brings us to Section 3, contrasting cultural well-being.
The crucial takeaway, so far, is that these economic and safety frameworks naturally shape the overall culture. Culturally, the U.S. prioritizes individual liberty, philanthropy, and market-driven access. There is just much less emphasis on state-mandated social justice outcomes. Scandinavian nations, however, explicitly anchor their public policy in egalitarianism, gender equity, and universal welfare as a public good. It is a fundamental difference in what these societies view as the ultimate role and goal of their governments and institutions.
And the real-world result of that cultural framing is absolutely profound. Because of high institutional trust, low corruption, and immense personal security, you simply don't spend mental energy worrying about basic survival. That lack of societal friction causes cognitive life satisfaction to skyrocket. Because of this, Scandinavian nations completely dominate the Cantor ladder of life satisfaction, leaving the US and UK trailing generally between 20th and 25th place globally. When you have high post-tax income equality and the absolute knowledge that your basic needs are secured, you simply experience life differently.
Okay, let's pivot to Section 4, healthcare and longevity.
So let's see how these cultural priorities literally affect how long people live. There is a fascinating paradox here. Despite the US spending vastly more of its GDP on healthcare than any peer nation, it suffers from a significantly lower life expectancy, around 77 to 79 years. This is compared to the UK, which sits at roughly 80 to 81 years, though that number has actually stalled post-2013. Meanwhile, Scandinavia sees consistently high, steady gains, with life expectancy reaching 82 to 84 years. To really understand this longevity gap, you have to look at the daily healthcare experience. Scandinavia achieves its superior longevity through equitable, population-based preventative medicine and strong social determinants of health. The UK utilizes a universal system, but it's one that is currently battling severe backlogs and waiting lists for things like cancer pathways and mental health services. And the US? Well, despite high expenditures and genuinely good survival rates for specific screened cancers, access is highly variable based on your insurance. This leads to stark health disparities, higher preventable mortality, and high cardiovascular disease mortality driven by lifestyle and socioeconomic divides.
Finally, let's wrap this up with Section 5, the structural trade-off. To tie all of this data together, we have to look at the ultimate trade-offs each society has decided to make. Step 1. Scandinavia optimizes collective life satisfaction, superior longevity, and high social trust. But they pay for it through very high taxation. Step 2. The UK attempts a middle ground hybrid approach. Universal healthcare paired with lower taxation than Scandinavia, but it struggles with infrastructural strain and slower economic productivity. Step 3. The USA successfully maximizes nominal GDP, disposable income, and massive innovation capital, but the data shows this comes at the cost of social cohesion, stark health disparities, and elevated systemic violence.
Ultimately, this data beautifully illustrates the Marcinni's health capital framework we talked about at the start. It shows how distinct structural approaches directly dictate a population's autonomy and social justice. The framework tells us that evaluating a health system isn't just about counting hospital beds, it's about the social contract. It's about how policy decisions around taxation, labor laws, and social safety nets combine to give citizens true autonomy, robust social justice, and ultimately a deep enjoyment of life. It reminds us that policy is deeply personal. So, knowing that every system requires giving something up to gain something else, which structural trade-off do you think is actually worth making? Do you prioritize absolute individual financial liberty and innovation, like the US? Do you prefer a middle ground approach, like the UK? Or does the egalitarian, high-tax, high-security Scandinavian model seem like the best path to a satisfying life? The data is crystal clear on the outcomes, but the values you prioritize, well, those are entirely up to you. Thanks for joining me for this explainer, and keep questioning the structures around you.